Right, well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see so many people have joined us this morning. A really big thank you and a warm welcome from all of us at Hargreaves Lansdown. So today's topic is the gender pay gap and, of course, the gender pension gap. It's a really crucial issue, but it's not publicised as much as the gender pay gap. We have two super guest speakers today who are both experts in their field and passionate about the topic. So we're going to keep this session to about 35 minutes this morning. And our aim is, first of all, to see what the gender pension gap actually is, ask our attendees, and also look at how men and women deal with finances differently. Also, what can you do in your workplace to help? So we'd love to hear from you as you go. Please do use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. So we'll be keeping an eye on questions coming in during the webinar, and we'll do our best to answer as many as we can during the live Q&A session at the end. So some introductions. I'm Richard Turner. I'm part of the team at HL Workplace, and we work with lots of employers, particularly professional services companies, providing workplace pensions and financial wellbeing programs. So our guest speaker today is Debi O'Donovan. I'm delighted that she can join us. She's founder and director of REBA, which is the Reward and Employee Benefits Association. Many of you are, I'm sure, members of the REBA community already and may have attended the first ever virtual Employee Wellbeing Congress event, which Hargreaves Lansdown sponsored. Now, Debi's usually in this seat putting the questions to her panelists, but today the roles are reversed. So welcome, Debi. Good morning to you. And you got your mute on, so don't forget to just...
Yes. Morning, Richard, and hello to everybody this morning.
It's that classic, you've got your mute on. Yeah, welcome, Debi. And we also welcome Clare Stinton from our team of financial wellbeing specialists. Clare delivers financial education to employees week in, week out. And Clare specialised in the gender pay gap, as well as issues affecting the way that women invest and how they deal with their wider financial issues. So good morning to you, Clare.
Morning.
Good morning. So straight to you, Debi. So before we get on to the gender pension gap in particular, would you be able to give our audience a quick idea of what REBA actually does, please?
Yes, Richard. So REBA is the Reward and Employee Benefits Association. And as it says, we are a membership organisation for reward and employee benefit professionals, HR professionals in medium to large organisations, and who look after pay, bonuses, pensions, workplace savings, employee benefits, wellbeing. And our membership also includes all the leading vendors in this market, the EBCs, insurers, and so on, including, I'm very pleased to say, Hargreaves Lansdown.
Great. So look, let's crack on with the gender pension gap. Let's actually just start off with a bit of a definition. What do we mean by the gender pensions gap?
So when we talk about the gender pensions gap, we usually mean the difference in the size of the savings pot of the average woman in retirement compared to the average man at retirement. And the latest Scottish Widows research on this issue puts this gap at about £100,000 between the two genders on average. But we could also look at the gap in what the average woman versus the average man earns in retirement. And I saw a recent More to Life report, and they put that figure at £186,000 between the two. So really, really big numbers. But I think for me, the most useful gaps for HR professionals to watch out for, and it's probably more manageable to think about in our daily jobs, is that difference between the monthly contributions between the two genders on average. So just to explain that a bit more, even if both genders put exactly the same percentage of salary into their pension each month, because of the gender pay gap, the average pounds and pence going in would create a savings gap. And examples, again, going back to the Scottish Widows report, it's quite well known for looking at this gap. They looked at if the average 20-something man put in 12% of earnings compared to the average earning 20-something woman, that gap would be £1,300 a year. I think they use 12% being the minimum that many advisors would tend to recommend for a 20-something in order to give them an adequate pension in the retirement. But of course, not everybody's even saving whatever their percentage amount is into the pension. So let's say 12% if you're in your 20s, and this is where you find the next gap. The Scottish Widows found that only 46% of women were saving 12% of salary into a pension, that's women in their 20s, compared to 56% of men. So right at their 20s, men are ahead of the game in terms of saving an adequate amount. So really, if you're an employer who's serious about equality, inclusion, good pensions outcomes, delving into these monthly differentials is really important. Have a look at the age differences, gender, ethnicity, so you can spot these gaps as early as possible.
Yeah, and it's interesting you mentioned that 12% contribution level, and of course that's if you start in your early 20s. In reality, that's not always possible. And I know sitting in on some of the sessions that Claire and her team do, when they mention it's 15% that people actually need to put in, and the longer you leave it, the greater that's going to take. It's longer time to take to catch up. That's when the jaws start dropping and you go, yeah, it's actually something that's you need to really engage with early on. And it's only a matter of doing small increases, in a disciplined way, maybe absorbed by things like salary increases or something like that over your career period, where you can make a big difference. But it's down to knowing that that's what you need to do. It's all about the engagement, the education side of it. So on to your next question, Debbie. What is it that actually makes the gender gap in pensions so much worse than for pay?
So there's a number of hidden financial decisions and behaviours that can exacerbate the gap in a way that probably wouldn't happen with pay in the same way. So, and just to say, when I'm running through this, I don't always mean all women, just as I don't mean that men never do these things. I'm talking broad average data from reputable reports that are showing these kind of gaps. So firstly, women as a group tend to have less appetite for risk when it comes to investments. A recent Aegon report found that when they did some research earlier this year, looking at the appetite for risk during March and July, when stock markets were down, they found that just under half of men were going to make the most of that opportunity to put more into their investments to make the most of any comeback. Whereas in contrast, only a third of women were prepared to take that risk to reap the reward of any recovery. Now, you can sort of look at that and go, well, probably if you're on average earning less, you might feel you need to play it safer with your savings. But, and Claire might have a view of whether that's a good idea or whether you need to be playing catch up. But the other area they found was that, again, the Aegon survey, they found that women earlier this year were more inclined to consider decreasing their pension contributions because of the pandemic. So small numbers, but you see a differential. 15% of women said they were thinking about decreasing their pension contributions. Only 10% of men were saying they want to decrease contributions. And not surprising, so many surveys show that women tend to have greater financial pressure on day-to-day expenses on average. And you might say, oh, well, surely childcare is partly to blame for this, maybe single mothers trying to support children. But we even see these higher rates of debt among older women compared to older men, finding pressure about day-to-day expenses. Right at the beginning, I mentioned the More to Life report. There they found that a third of women in their mid-50s who'd been in debt in the last 5 years said it was due to day-to-day expenses, but it was just a quarter of men of the same age who had that. So again, you see these things exacerbating that gap in ability to save.
Yeah, and it's where if money's tight, where can you make those savings? We're doing a lot of work around budgeting and debt management at the moment, and employees were coming to us saying, "Can we stop our pension contribution?" And of course, that in the long term is a false economy, but also in the short term, is it actually saving you that much? Because of course, pension contributions are very tax efficient, and the other thing that people don't think about is that you're going to be missing out on your employer matching contribution as well. So actually, you're missing out big time Yeah, the other point was about your the drop in the stock market. So around lockdown one, which was around 20-30%. It was a time when we were hugely busy in terms of our input, our people who self-invest. There was a massive amount of trading activity going on the platform. It would have been fascinating to know what the balance was there between men and women,
Yeah.
who was taking the action, who were topping up their pensions, making the most of that dip. So moving on, surely having children and taking time out of work does have a big impact on women's pension savings as well, though.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, this is huge. Being the child bearer does put women at a big disadvantage when it comes to pension savings, and I think it's a disadvantage that we've barely even scraped the surface on. Direct Line Life Insurance came out with a great report recently, and it looked, because of the lower contributions that go into a pension during maternity leave, women are losing out on massive amounts of cumulative interest that they would have earned on their savings and investments until their retirement. And Direct Line calculated this cumulative lifetime loss in interest for all these women, and they reckon it's sitting at around £620 million a year for all women. Or let's put it in smaller numbers that make it a bit more understandable. They use the example that if you had a woman earning an average salary and she was to have 3 children in her 30s, take a year off maternity leave for each of her children, her pension pot at retirement would be about £15,000, just over £15,000 lower than if she hadn't had children. She'd also have lost out on £55,000 worth of earnings. So maternity leave has a huge negative impact on earnings and savings for women. And I strongly believe that we really need to call out people and employers who use maternity leave as an excuse to explain away gender pay gaps and gender pensions gaps. Having children is an enormous contribution to society. So I believe that society needs to rethink how to reward women for this essential contribution to the human race, and not financially penalize them for that contribution, which is effectively what we currently do. I don't think we do it deliberately, but actually if you think about it, that's what's happening. So big rethink that needed there, Richard.
Yeah, absolutely. And just thinking about what men and women can achieve from their pension pots when they actually get to retirement. With women potentially living longer. And I'm thinking back to 2012 when we did away with the difference between annuity rates for men and women, and annuity rates became gender neutral. And in fact, at the time, women's annuity rates went up and men's annuity rates came down. So there's a sort of a counterbalance there as well. But lots of things going on in terms of, are you going to end up better off or worse off? So bringing things right up to sort of the current time, do you think that the changes in working due to the pandemic have actually affected the gender pension gap in new ways?
So whether it has happened already, I'm not sure, but I think there's definitely a danger ahead. Watch out. And I'm going to go into some areas that cover the aspect of working life that HR professionals, which I believe are most of our audience this morning, will be familiar with. And maybe at first glance, you'll think, what on earth have that got to do with the gender pensions gap? But bear with me, because I want to explain some of these workplace foundations going on now during the pandemic that could reduce some women's ability to save in the short, medium and long term. So the first thing I want to have a look at is job losses. So organizations such as the UN, the International Labour Organization, have huge amounts of data showing the disproportionate hit on women's jobs this year. Or picking out a McKinsey report from July, and they showed that COVID-19, due to COVID-19, globally women's job losses were 1.8 times higher than men's job losses. Or to put it another way, women tend to make up 39% of global employment, but they have accounted for 54% of overall job losses due to the pandemic. An interesting point to note at this point is that during a typical recession, men tend to take the brunt of job losses. And what that has done to things like the gender pay gap is it's shrunk it during that time. But in a pandemic recession, it's the other way around. It actually increases the gender pay gap because women take the brunt of job losses. The TUC came out with a report earlier a few months ago showing that women who are pregnant or on maternity leave, they felt under more pressure to take redundancy or go on furlough. And while that might have been done with all the best intentions to say, I've got to look after children, this makes sense for me to do this, and maybe perhaps our partner keeps working or so on, actually it's not good in the long term, because people who fall out of the workplace rarely go back to the earning levels that they were at before. And so of course you can see how that would exacerbate any gaps that might already be in the system. So these kinds of things, if we should project this forward, we can see that any gains we've made in closing the gender pay gap and hopefully then towards the gender pensions gap is likely to actually regress back years due to the pandemic, maybe even decades if we don't get a grasp of it. And just to add, Richard, in terms, I've mentioned recession, in the recession that started in 2007, we saw that more women than men dipped into retirement savings. So that could well be happen again now, which would again widen that gender pensions gap.
Yeah, and there's always the danger, if you dip into your pension, of course, you can only dip into your pensions if you're over 55, but there is the danger that you take out some tax-free cash while you're working, and it's going to take that much longer to then recoup that gain. And also there's dangers if you start drawing income. People don't know that will severely restrict your ability to put money back into your fund going further. In some circumstances it can reduce it down to £4,000 in terms of contributions going forward. So there are certain risks dipping into your pension pot, even though it might seem readily available. And again, that comes down to education. So thinking about the new sort of working practices that the pandemic has imposed on us, one of the biggest impacts of the recession is the huge rise in working from home. And what about the increased pressure on childcare as a result of that?
Yeah, so I think lots of us have seen that incredible upside of the pandemic is how much more acceptable it has become to work from home, to work flexibly, to work part-time. It allows us to fit our jobs according to our lifestyles. We're all productive at different times of day. We can adapt to that. So there's been some really positive things to take from it, but there's a dark side as well. And again, this tends to hit more women than men, according to the surveys I've seen. So there was a poll run by Ipsos Mori in September, which found that half of mothers said they'd taken on more childcare responsibilities because of lockdown, and that compared to a quarter of fathers. We at REBA have seen an increased interest in childcare providers and services, and also services such as tutors via workplace benefits. But we know that good childcare was expensive and in short supply before the pandemic. Adding COVID-19 cases, the need to self-isolate, and childcare is still falling even today back onto parents, usually the mother, to pick up the pieces right at the moment. So it comes as no surprise that mothers are more likely than fathers to consider going from full-time work into part-time work, resulting in an obvious drop in pay. And then, of course, that will have a knock-on to the how much they save in pensions. And lots of employers might go, look, it's not for us to get involved in home decisions and who goes part-time and who stays working full-time. But these shifts are big, and they are impacting the productivity of key groups of employees, and that will affect future talent pipelines. It will affect workforce planning. So this does actually matter to HR.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's, from a reward and benefits point of view, it's very easy just to sort of pigeonhole employees as employees. And I think a lot of HR people are thinking, it's not just about the employees. They may not have been furloughed, they may not have been, taken a drop in income, but what about the spouse? What about the partner? What about the impact that childcare is having on the family units? And therefore, can we bring in other members of the family into financial wellbeing programs, getting people to engage about, what would happen if you were long-term sick, if you passed away? It's actually a matter of sharing the discussion, the money, the money discussion with the rest of the members of the family. So I know you've been looking closely at the impact of the pandemic on employee productivity as well. So could you tell us more about that?
Yes, I'd like to share a graph, Richard, that I've asked a couple of academics to run for this event today. And I want to say a big thank you to Professor Alan Felstead of Cardiff University and Darja Riska of the University of Southampton for doing this for us. They put out a report looking at home working in the UK before and during the 2020 lockdown, and I asked them would they mind rerunning some of the data split by gender, which they didn't do in the original report, so we could see the difference of impact on self-reported productivity. And if you look at the graph on screen, you can see that men, which is the blue line, are more likely to report that they get more done when working from home, and they're less likely to report that they get less done. And women, the orange line, it's the reverse. They're more likely to report that they get less done when working from home and are less likely to report that they get more done. So, yeah, it's not like it's black and white, one or the other, but you can see there's a gap there on who feels more or less productive. Now, I've just shown the overall graph today because I think that's probably the more likely scenario when we come out of this pandemic, that people will be working at home sometimes, occasionally, all the time. But if you actually dug into this data more specifically and only looked at those people working all the time from home, that becomes even bigger between men and women. Now, this particular research didn't look at the causes of these gender differences, but if you look back at the Ipsos Mori poll that I referred to earlier, there women were really showing through as bearing the mental brunt of the pandemic. They were having to be always on for more than men. They were having to juggle work more. They had multiple responsibilities and were more at risk of burnout. And that same poll found that more women than men felt their work-life balance had worsened since COVID-19. And the women felt more under pressure to prove that they were working. And just in contrast, I know this isn't relevant, this isn't about pension savings, but it was men who were saying they had higher satisfaction from working from home than women tended to do. And women tended to say that they felt more motivated when they were in the office. So I want to throw in here to say, watch out for any survey that doesn't show you gender splits, because they usually are going to mask a true full picture. And I'm finding this is especially true when it comes to home working.
Yeah, and I've got to say, I've noticed more emails being written late at night. And that tends to be more women than men, having thought about that. But I think, there are people squeezing in work in between home commitments. And that counts for both men and women, of course. But, there is this thing coming in, switch on in the morning, emails being sent at 10, 11, 12 o'clock at night. And you've got to think, that a lot of pressure to be able to, to be putting people under. So all of this makes a lot of sense, Debbie, and I really appreciate your input. And can I just remind everybody that if you do want to ask any questions, use the Q&A box. It'd be great. There's some coming in which are really interesting. We'll touch on later on. But if you've got any questions, do put those in there. It's anonymous, so don't be shy. So can you talk us through how the shift then plays through into the gender pensions gap, all of the things that we've been talking about so far? Okay,
so we saw that self-reported productivity gap and the pressure that women are under. So my question to our HR professionals in the audience, our reward professionals, if you've got a group of employees that appear to be less productive than another group of employees, what's going to happen when it comes to your pay review time? How are you going to be making those decisions? Are you going to use the same criteria as previous years? What about them trying to meet their bonus targets? What could happen to any promotions that are on the table, or a future career progression. It's not surprising that 43% of working women are worried about job or promotion prospects, according to the Fawcett Society report that came out a couple of weeks ago on Equal Pay Day. This is a concern. Women are aware of this. These seemingly small differentials between gender performance have the potential to play through in quite nasty ways. And overall, as I've said, many women are actually working harder in both their work and personal lives right now. And Richard, you mentioned this times of the emails that you're getting through. But they could also be the ones that face the money or career setbacks that perhaps quite a lot of men are less likely to face, which in turn will widen the gender pay gap and therefore the gender pensions gap. This pandemic is temporary. And especially with all the announcements about the vaccines, we know it's not going to be that much longer. And I just hope that employers can see their way to not let these temporary circumstances become long-term penalties, and maybe put in measures that may be temporary, or maybe think through to future how we're going to change work in the future that will prevent any increases in gaps at this very crucial time.
That's really interesting. I've not heard that angle before. So what are the key areas that we need to focus in able to shift the dial on the gender pensions gap?
So there's probably three key areas that I want to bring up, but I know yourselves as the pensions professionals, there's a longer list, but staying with my area of expertise. Firstly, the point I've just made about performance, I'd say first have a look at setting realistic expectations and re-evaluate your performance criteria to match these new ways of working. For example, don't criticize employees for working outside core hours, for example. There might be a reason for it. And this could just help relieve some of that pressure and exhaustion that's particularly affecting certain groups of women. I appreciate companies are probably under financial pressure. They might find it hard to be generous, but that means thinking differently rather than sticking to old HR levers or reward levers that might now drive productivity down because of our changed circumstances. And if you do make any changes, even if they're temporary, make sure it's communicated, make sure your managers know about it and staff know about it. There are some companies who have done this, but then found that not all their staff were aware of it. Secondly, I mentioned that when people do not work for a while, they are more likely to find worse jobs when they re-enter. Similarly, people who reduce working hours tend to miss out on career opportunities. But there's a fantastic case study that reported just 2 weeks ago, and we can learn a lot from that one, and that's the insurance firm Zurich. It wanted to tackle its gender pay gap. This was before the pandemic, so it started doing this last year. They changed all the recruitment policies so that all jobs, no matter how senior, were advertised as flexible, and they made sure everything was in gender neutral language. And as I say, 2 weeks ago in November, they reported that they'd seen a 20% jump in the number of women applying for management roles, and they actually landed up appointing a third more women to senior roles. And they saw a doubling the number of both male and female job applications, which means they had a bigger talent pool to recruit from. And I think this was a great example of a company thinking differently that could and reaped fantastic rewards for their business. But that should also move the dial on their gender pay gap, and one would think their gender pensions gap. Thirdly, my third point is think differently, because thinking differently means involving different people who can spot different problems and solutions. We saw the incredible impact the footballer Marcus Rashford made with his school lunches campaign. He had a different life experience to bring to bear, which resulted in a better outcome for so many poor children. And if we currently look at who, especially at government level, are making the most of the pandemic recovery decisions, it's men. And this needs to be rebalanced to represent all of society. And maybe that inner circle, the top echelon of government, need to be reminding that women do make up 50% of the population. And I'd put that same question to employers. Are employee voices from all your demographics involved in your recovery discussions, or is there a skew to a particular gender or race or social class? Because we're never going to sort out the gender pensions gap if we perpetuate traditional behaviours from one group and only use one group to solve it. We need more diverse thinking and more diverse solutions to move the dial on those savings gap and the earnings gap. Women know they need to save more. That isn't where the solution lies. It's the structures that we have in place right now that we need, and HR are right in the hot seat at the table that can help to change that.
Yeah, and coming back to the, removing the stigma about money and it being an awkward subject to talk about, and removing the stigma that pensions are boring, and they're just for old people. So, there's a lot of I suppose unconscious bias against pensions and money, and we need to try and educate that out of people and say, this is real. We're talking about your life savings, and one day you're going to have to rely on the money that you're saving now, and to try and put it into perspective. So Debi, it's been great having you with us today. If you were going to leave us with one point to take away, what would it be?
So we talk about a gender pay gap, we talk about a gender pensions gap, but we really have a gender data gap. Too often women are invisible in surveys and we only see the overall default data. So I really want to appeal to HR people, when you run your data across different segmentations, make sure you also split by gender across those segmentations. My favourite book is just behind me here, Invisible Woman by Caroline Credo Perez. I'm not on commission, I've never met the woman, but I really recommend it as a must read for anybody trying to close gender gaps. Because if you don't look at the data by gender, you're not going to even spot the problems, never mind work out how to solve them. So the gender question is vital in your surveys, and it's vital to imply gender to your analytics. It really, really does matter.
Brilliant. Debi, can I ask you to stay with us? We've got some questions coming in. There's a couple I think you'd like to answer. So if you could just stick with us, that would be great. Before we speak to Claire, we're going to run a quick poll just to keep you going. You should be able to see that on your screen at the moment. And it is, what does your current pension provider or advisor offer to support women? So first of all, tick 1 if you don't know, tick 2 if there's nothing specific, 3 information on the website, 4 webinars, 5 one-to-one meetings. So about half of you have voted so far. Really weird. So anybody who hasn't voted, if you could just click on that, please, that's great. So, okay, so I'm just going to end that and share the results. So that's interesting. So 30% and 30% either I don't know or nothing specific, and some people already have webinars about the gender pension gap, which is super. It's 19%, and one-to-one meetings are available for about 19% as well. So leaning towards the need for more information and more on the gender pension gap. So I'm going to stop that. So I'm going to close that. So Claire, over to you. Now you have been you've been delivering financial education to employees week in and week out for nearly 4 years with Hargreaves Lansdown. So perhaps you could start by giving our audience an idea of how you and the financial wellbeing team actually help employees to engage with their finances.
That's right. So I've been at wider HL for nearly 7 years, but on the wellbeing team for 4 years. So my team are the on-site presence. Our day-to-day is usually spent travelling the country. We would be based at employer offices. We're responsible for delivering the financial education, for implementing pension schemes, but also hosting individual meetings with clients. Albeit at the moment, of course, everything is taking place virtually, given our current predicament. So the one-to-ones are a really important part of our service, because actually they allow employees to sit down with us one-on-one or over the phone, and they get the opportunity to ask any questions that they might have regarding their own personal circumstances or any challenges that they're facing. And they also get the opportunity to perhaps delve deeper into topics that we've covered by group webinar, and they can do that away from their peers and in confidence. So over the last 6 months or so, my team of 12 have hosted over 2,100 of those meetings. So it's really our job to engage employees, and we do that through simplifying and explaining the unknown. So it's a young and dynamic team, and that brings a different spin to what are often dry and complicated topics. So modules might include things such as retirement options, the complexities around withdrawing money from your pension. We might also cover things such as, a really popular one is building a house deposit, so the efficiencies of savings around that and what products are on offer to help people to save up. Or another topic might be budgeting and debt management. So it's everything we discuss is informational. We don't provide financial advice, but what we will do is talk through the information and considerations, and it means that people can make better informed decisions.
Thanks, Debbie. Thanks, Claire. So on to your experience with the gender pension gap. So we heard from Debbie earlier about the various causes behind the gender pension gap. Is there anything that you'd like to add? Is there perhaps one factor that you see being the biggest driver of this disparity?
Yeah, so Debbie explained that it is multifaceted, and actually the severity of the gap can affect different generations of women differently. That's what we're seeing. Research does suggest, much like Debbie explained, that motherhood tends to be the factor that actually leads to that biggest disparity between pension values. And it's what's being termed the motherhood penalty. And that's because actually that one decision has multiple points of impact throughout a woman's life. So we know that actually women that have children under the age of 33 are most likely to be affected. That's likely because they've taken time out of their career at a really pivotal moment. That's going to impact their career progression going forward and therefore their earnings potential. On top of that, we know that women are usually the primary carer for any children, and that's throughout their lives. They also then are likely to be the primary carer for any elderly relatives at a later stage. And we found that's really a compounded problem because the female partner has taken time off at a previous point to have children, perhaps had a career break, therefore might be on a lower salary or doing lower hours. It then makes sense for that same person to have a break again at a later stage caring for elderly parents. So actually 75% of part-time workers are women, and that's because part of their time is allocated to unpaid domestic work, and that's work that they don't receive pension contributions for from an employer, and they don't receive a salary. So there's this overarching issue that women generally have a lower earnings capacity. And that, of course, can impact actually their ability to build savings throughout their life, not just their pension savings. One area that we haven't yet mentioned is actually the impact that divorce can have on pensions and actually wider female financial resilience. Divorced women, on average, retire with savings 75% less than their male counterparts. And if we think of couples getting divorced, the largest assets outside of the house tend to be the pension. And it's believed that women are really underestimating the value of their partner's pensions, either through a lack of understanding or lack of guidance or lack of education, and they're favouring the more sentimental assets. There's a tendency for them to prioritise immediate financial needs over their future financial needs. And actually that can really disadvantage them moving forwards in the long run. Around 70 to 80% of women surveyed actually said that pensions weren't included in their divorce settlement. So women that are contemplating divorce really need to be aware of not only their own pensions and their savings, they need to be aware of their partner's pensions and savings. On the whole, divorce rates are decreasing, and that's probably because less people are getting married, but actually divorce rates are increasing for the over 60s. And it's this particular age group who are likely to have the biggest assets built up, and also they're that much closer to retirement. They're also perhaps a generation where the women have spent more time at the household looking after children and perhaps less time in the workforce. So they really need to consider their future income needs if they're going through this process.
Yeah, and it's interesting you say about sharing information and knowing what one another has in pensions and savings, where very often traditionally it would just be one person being in control of the money, and I think it's so important for that to be shared. So I know, as you mentioned earlier on, you spend most of your time at employer offices hosting group sessions and individual meetings with employees face to face, albeit everything's moved to Zoom nowadays, and probably will be for the foreseeable future. But from your experience, do men and women actually approach finances differently?
Absolutely. So on the whole, men are more likely to make an investment decision there and then, and they tend to be slightly more impulsive. Whereas women might take a slightly more considered approach. They're likely to ask for further information. They may want to research it later after the session. It's also common for them to indicate that they might want to discuss their options with a partner or family member before placing any instruction. And this, of course, relies on them then actually placing that instruction at a later date. We all know that women lead busy lives, particularly if they're juggling childcare and work. Interestingly, I've also personally found that women are more likely to ask about ethical or responsible investments within meetings in comparison to men. And that's those investments that actually look to make a positive social and environmental impact, as well as provide a financial return. Standard Life, interestingly, found that actually 14% more men prioritised high financial returns over social environmental impact compared to women. It can also sometimes be apparent in meetings that women have had a crash course in finance through necessity, not through choice. So wealth is often passed down to women, whether it be through the loss of a partner, whether it be through divorce, or simply because they have a longer life expectancy and they're forced into controlling their finances. They haven't done it before, and it's in what usually is already a difficult circumstance. I know that in my particular group of friends, it's more likely that the men dabble in the stock market. They might discuss investing opportunities. There tends to be more of a genuine interest, and that leads to learning and them controlling the finances. Whereas with women, that curiosity perhaps around stock markets and investments isn't as dominant. And actually, this is a really important area because investments are fundamental in medium to long-term savings opportunities, because actually one of the most overlooked areas of pension planning is investments, and it could play a vital role in bridging that gender pension gap. So education is really needed to explain that relationship between risk and reward, understanding that there is actually risk in taking no risk at all, because we know that inflation will erode the value of any savings over 5 years or more generally. So during the pandemic, over 50% of men checked their investments and less than a third of women checked theirs. Data from our client base also shows that men are more likely to make an active investment selection outside of the default in comparison to women. I ran a case study earlier this year with one of our Hargreaves Lansdown clients. In order to go on site to do the gender pension gap, I surveyed the women beforehand, and I found that 56% of women blamed lack of knowledge for their poor engagement with investments or pensions, and a further 33% blamed lack of time. So that's actually a bit of an emerging pattern. I've had that come through the surveys before with previous clients. And it suggests that perhaps women set the bar too high when it comes to investing, that they equate being a good and knowledgeable investor with making it a really time-consuming hobby. And that's just not the case. When it comes to pensions, it's commonplace that people would invest in a fund. And actually, the benefits there are that women themselves, they don't have to be experts. They can have an expert make those decisions on their behalf. And at the same time, that actually will reduce their costs, their time, and their administration.
Yeah, and I think generally speaking, we need to, as an industry, we need to make it easier for people to be able to engage with their pensions. Being able to check your pension as easily on your mobile phone as it is to check your bank account or do your shopping. And some of our research has shown that I think 25% of people didn't know that their pension, vast majority of their pension, is actually invested in the stock market. You know, simple things like that we can just help people understand better. And as you say, there can be massive differences between a medium risk returns on a medium risk fund and a higher risk fund over such a long period of time people are investing in their pension schemes. So what can women do to avoid falling victim to the pension gap?
Yes, so evidence suggests that there are really two main factors which can have the biggest impact on a pension value and therefore retirement income. And the first is the obvious, the self-explanatory, it's how much are people contributing. And the second is actually the level of investment return achieved. And the good news is that these two factors, contributions and investments, are the two that actually we as individuals have the greatest degree of control and influence over. So here it is definitely the case that being forewarned is being forearmed. education is really important, and the earlier the better, because women need to be proactive. So for women like myself, so I'm in my late 20s, haven't yet had children, it's really important that we consider paying more into our pension now to compensate for perhaps a later date when contributions might be reduced. That's best that we plan for a potential career break, because if you save more in your 20s, the money has longer to grow. Compound growth can help that money work harder over the longer term. And that's where you can earn returns on any past returns. And that's, again, helping to assist to bridge that gap. It's also crucial that we educate men as well as women on the implications of certain joint decisions as partners. They are fathers as well. And men can perhaps be part of the solution. So conversations need to take place between partners regarding their finances. The distribution of wealth, particularly if there is one breadwinner within the family. Very few male clients ask me what can be done for their spouse's pension if they're currently unemployed because they're looking after their children. And most are actually unaware that they can contribute £2,880 to their spouse's pension, and that pension will benefit from 20% basic rate tax relief from the government at a value of £720, so topping it up to £3,600. Access to affordable childcare is usually the primary obstacle for women returning to work. So shared parental leave could also be part of the answer. And this benefit allows couples with a new baby to share up to 50 weeks of leave, and they'll also split that statutory pay between them. However, last year, only 2% of eligible couples actually made use of that shared parental leave, when nearly 650,000 women claimed maternity pay. So reports actually suggest that poor uptake is down to poor financial incentives, that couples weren't willing to see the breadwinner's income fall, or they simply couldn't afford to lose that income. So with higher earners often being the man, the childcare and the associated period of limited maternity pay often defaults to being the woman's burden. If women were able to return to the workplace sooner, they would have a better chance of promotion or maintaining their longer hours, perhaps not needed to do as part-time work, and that would mean in turn higher salaries and higher levels of contribution into their pension from their employer.
So thinking about the current pandemic again, in your opinion, how has the pandemic impacted the pension gap to make it better or worse?
I mean, it's difficult to say. Between 2017 and 2019, the gender pension gap has increased year on year, though it remains around 40%. This year, we know that COVID has meant financial hardship for many people. It's likely that the pandemic has forced people to look at or prioritise their immediate financial needs over any future financial needs. And that might mean that some women have had to look at their pension contributions and potentially decrease them. We do know that women are 1.5 times more likely to have had to quit their job or lost their job over this period. However, we're unlikely to know the extent of the full damage or any further widening of the pension gap until further down the line when we've got the complete picture. I know that Debbie's already mentioned this, but on a more positive note, COVID has provided a catalyst for more flexible working hours. And this is really promising for women who can perhaps stay in the same job that they had before they became a parent. Perhaps they are able to increase their hours because there's more flexible working and they can therefore juggle childcare. Men can also perhaps play a part in this in terms of sharing that childcare if they're able also to work from home. And Debbie already mentioned that actually that behavioural insights team at Zurich did find that 20% more women were applying for senior roles, and that's going to have an impact potentially on their earnings capacity and again on how much is going into their pension. So that's a really promising piece of the puzzle.
Clare, it's fascinating to hear your insight on it as well, and combined with Debbie's knowledge and experience. So I hope it's been really useful session for everybody who's logged in today. Given your experience with employers, what can employers, industry, government do to assist women in achieving financial equality and indeed resilience?
So I think the most obvious one would be looking for the government to look at auto enrolment minimums. So perhaps looking at the age of entrance. At the moment, it's 22. But as we've learned, women need to be proactive. The earlier that money goes into their pension, the better. The level of contributions at the moment is a combined 8 or 9%, depending on how employers qualify pay. Our research indicates that 12% over an average 50-year career would allow an individual to achieve a moderate level of income within retirement. So it's not quite at that level yet, unless people are contributing above those minimums. That also doesn't factor in the additional challenges that women face. So it is a case of, education and making sure that they're aware of the difficulties that might be posed throughout their career. The £10,000 salary threshold with one employer also excludes a huge number of part-time workers from receiving contributions from their employer, particularly if they work multiple jobs. And we know that 81% of 30 to 59-year-old part-time workers are women. Unfortunately, women alone can't single-handedly achieve financial and pension equality. As an industry, we need to keep building momentum. We need to keep raising awareness. I started working on the gender pension gap a couple of years ago, and I'm really pleased to say there is a heightened awareness around it today. By 2025, 60% of the wealth in the UK is expected to be in women's hands. And here it's really the case that knowledge is power, so education needs to take place, the earlier the better. Practical financial education in schools, concepts such as compound growth, how interest works, how to get a mortgage. And I can't tell you how many times I've heard in a meeting, why aren't we taught this earlier? And then finally, wellbeing programs in the workplace. That means access to information is made as easy as possible for people that are already juggling busy lives. Financial worries are the biggest cause of stress outside of the workplace. So actually, it's a win-win for employers because it increases employee morale, but also efficiency.
So yeah, totally agree on the, why aren't we taught this earlier? My children, when they were at school, the personal finance wasn't a compulsory subject on the PSHE syllabus, which I found surprising. And actually, I did some work in some local schools, and it's actually interesting how well people do absorb, basic concepts around finance. Claire, thank you very much. Stick with us. There's some questions coming, which I know you'd love to add as well. Before we move on to the questions and answer session, though, we're going to do another quick poll, which should be appearing on your screen shortly. So to what extent would you like to offer more support for women in your wellbeing strategy? So if you're happy with what you've got, tick 1. If you're going to leave it up to your existing pension provider or advisor, tick 2. If you're keen to add it to your existing wellbeing program, 3. Or if you need to introduce a financial wellbeing program to include gender pay gap, it's 4. So 65% of people have voted. That's good. Okay, let's give that another couple of seconds. Just click your thing. Great. Okay, so that's very interesting. So only 5% are happy with what you've got, and 46% are going to add it to your existing program, and 32% need to introduce a financial wellbeing program to accommodate that. So thank you very much for participating in that. So there we go. Just going to close that and on to answering your questions. So thank you very much for sending those in while we were talking. So first of all, we've got a question for you, Debbie, if you're okay, if you can come off mute. So Debbie, do you think that the gender pension gap should be added to the gender pay reporting requirements? It's complex to calculate, but the government could set out a common formula. That's from Duncan Brown. There.
So thank you, Duncan. A nice difficult question. I know Duncan very well. A really good point, and I hadn't thought of that going that far myself. But I think he's got a point. If I had to go, well, there's a queue because you've still got the ethnicity pay gap reporting to come. I'd say let's do that first. That's really, really important because one links to the other. But yes, if we could get a formula that we could agree on, because I can imagine nothing more stark than if you had to say, right, employer, what percentage on average is going into women's pensions in your company versus men? That would be a wake-up call in itself. So more complicated than that, but yes, I think it would be a good direction of travel.
Great, thanks, Debbie. Claire, one for you if you want to come off mute. How would you go about integrating gender pension gap into a wellbeing program?
So it's one of the modules that we offer alongside other financial education topics such as looking at investment specifics or looking at building a house deposit, as we mentioned earlier. For clients that I've run the module with before, we've actually done a bit of a bespoke program. So I would survey the female employees on site beforehand, before going on site. And then I use that data and their thoughts about investments and pensions, and I feed that into the presentation. So we would hold a group session. That can either be run specifically for women, or men can be invited as well. It depends on how employers view their workforce, whatever would work best. Ultimately, they know their staff best. Or perhaps multiple sessions, some for both men and women, some just for women. And then after that, they would have the opportunity to sit down with myself or one of my team members to discuss their individual circumstances, and they can raise any questions that they have, perhaps they didn't want to in front of their peers.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Back to you, Debbie. Are you finding that REBA members are becoming more aware of the gender pension gap?
Honest answer is I'm not sure. However, I know that there's a lot of proactive movement among reward and HR people to look at equality in the workplace. The whole issue of diversity and inclusion is absolutely massive, and we at REBA are working hard to support that and to look at the various things that play into, as Claire said, it's complex, lots of things play into these gaps. So part of me coming onto this event today was that opportunity to focus on this more and to relate it to what HR and reward are facing day to day, so I can raise awareness. But I know employers are looking at everything, even things like, we haven't touched on that today, but the impact of menopause and women falling out of the workplace earlier and affecting productivity. So we try to hit right across that diversity spectrum to help these decisions be made so we don't have gaps in the future.
Okay, thanks for that. Can I just stick with you, Debbie? Another question. What are the most innovative and forward-thinking actions that a company could take to help close the gap?
We often talk about, well, what's new, what's different, what's innovative, what can we do that's different? But sometimes it's the old ways are the best ways. And I want to come back to a point Claire made, and that is sitting in a group of people that are relatable makes the most difference. And I was speaking to a people director at a large bank, and she was telling me a story about how they have it's taken a long time, but they've had groups of employees have done education and information for a long time, but now they've got people stepping up and being champions. So then they can speak to similar people working at a similar level. It could be young women, it could be middle-aged men, whatever it is, but they talk like to like. And when you actually hear somebody else, Claire, you talk about your friends and noticing what's happening in your age group. If you've got people like me in the work organization, people are more likely to listen. So I'd say to employers, train up groups of people who are interested and get them to talk to their peers. That's far more powerful than almost anything else that you can do. Education, education, education. That's the best way to go.
Yeah, Claire, what are your thoughts on that?
I'd absolutely agree. It's a shared problem. It's really uniting. And I know that actually a few of the companies that I've run the gender pension gap sessions with, it's come through women's networks or women's unions, and that shared problem has caused them to talk about it. I also think having a room full of women, they feel perhaps more confident to ask any question they might have that it's specifically a gendered issue. Yeah, it's absolutely the best way to go. I would also say from going to employer offices, it's also really useful for building rapport. There's some level of consistency with your financial well-being as well, because that means that there's an element of trust that's built up, and again, they feel more confident asking questions.
And I'm conscious of time. I think we're overrunning a bit, but there are some really good questions here, so I think we should make the most of it while we've got you here. So, Claire, how do you introduce this subject without segmenting or isolating women?
I mean, I guess it's difficult because it's a multifaceted issue, so it affects different women at different ages, or the different factors are important at different points of their lifestyle. I guess there's no segmentation. It's likely to affect every female at some point throughout their lives, and just being aware of where those points are so that you can make better informed decisions. It's not all about, are you able to afford to put more in? It's about, are you maximising your employer pension contributions? Are you perhaps engaging with your investments? Because that is the most overlooked area when it comes to pension planning. And it's having the time to sit down with someone or to listen to a webinar and have that explained in jargon-free terminology. And that will help you, therefore, again, make decisions that are going to benefit you in the long run.
Brilliant. Well, look, that's all that we've got time for today, I'm afraid. So if you do have any questions for Claire, Debbie, or the team, or you want to help, or if you want some help including the gender pension gap in your wellbeing strategy, do drop us an email. There will be a recording of today's webinar on our YouTube channel if you want to share with colleagues, along with our other HR Q&A webinars that we've run on financial resilience for employees and how to implement an effective financial wellbeing program. So thank you very much to you, Debbie and Claire, but most of all, thank you for everybody who's joined us this morning. Stay safe and have a great day. Goodbye.